So we're going to work through case study 1 for tutorial 3. All the files are over here on the side. We don't need to concern ourselves with most of them. The only 2 files that we will be looking at this evening are the layout CSS file and then the main home HTML file. Now the first thing that needs to happen is we need to connect the CSS files to the HTML, because if we don't do that, then things are going to break. And there's some important stuff that needs to happen as we do that. So we put those in the head of our HTML, and anything that is for the browser's purpose, in this case we're linking to other files so that we can gain CSS information, that's not content for the user, so it must go into the head. Anything that is content for the user goes in the body section of our HTML. Anything that is for the computer goes in the head. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to link to my different files, and the order that we are linking does matter. The order that we are going to be linking is, first I'm going to link to my base style sheet. So it's sp_base.css. So I've linked to that one. That is essentially the reset and some of the default styling that we want to have happen across the whole page. That's something that we're possibly continuing to use the same file between multiple pages on our site. That's normal as part of it. The next one that I need to link to is going to be and in this case, the order doesn't matter based on how the styles are written on this particular project, that I can link to my base styles, which set my fonts and colors and background images and colors. And I can do all of that. And then I have my CSS that's about the layout. And because we're working on the layout one, I'm going to link to my styles page next as part of it. And I'm looking over in my project window over here so I can see the naming of these, because I don't just magically have everything memorized. And then I'm going to finally link to my layout. And I did not rename the file per the instructions in the book of save and rename the file, modify the comments here, blah, 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 do all of that. I didn't do that just out of laziness, I guess, to be honest. Now that I have added these, I'm going to just take a look here. This is what the page looks like before we have linked to any of our style information. Now that I have linked to my base styles and to the color and font styles, but I have not linked or done any work in the layout because it's currently empty. That's what we're working on this project. I'll save it, go and refresh the page, and we'll see it adds in some base colors. So now the footer gets blue and it's centered. Get some centering and other stuff going on here. So we're going to have to move things over. So these links here are going to sit to the side of this picture. The whole page is going to take on a fixed width. Well, it's actually a variable width, but it's going to narrow it down. Then this navigation here is going to become a horizontal navigation bar. These pictures are going to shrink down. The text will show up underneath each one. It'll create a nice little gridded layout. And then we'll take our comments here, shrink those down, and make our whole page look nice and pretty. So we've completed that. We do need to keep this HTML file open, because as we look through the instructions, we're going to need to know what markup is being referred to, so we're able to adequately know what we need to write in our style, because the instructions coming out of the book don't specifically say, here, write this exact line of markup instead, or style rule. Instead, it just refers to it in more general English, which makes it a little bit tricky to sometimes tie the pieces together. So the first instruction that it's going to tell us to do is it's going to say, set a style rule for HTML that sets the height of the browser window to 100%. So now that's easy enough to type in, HTML height 100%. So that's one where it's fairly explicit of what it's actually asking us to do. The next one gets to be a little bit more interesting on here, because now it's asking to set the size of the page body. So I will say body So I'm creating a style rule for the body. And what it wants us to do is it wants to set the width to 95%. And it also wants the body to have then a minimum size and a maximum size. So it's going to have a minimum width of 640 pixels, and it's going to have a maximum width of 960 pixels. So we set these values, so this gives us our expando kind of window, so we can make it bigger and smaller, and it will be set to 95% of the available space when we're somewhere in between 640 and 960. But if we get bigger than 960, then it stops making it get bigger. And if we get smaller than 640, it doesn't keep shrinking it down. What we are not doing is what's referred to as responsive design, where we're taking into account really small screens, medium screens, large screens, and extra large screens. Instead, we're setting just some hard numbers. Down the road, we're going to look at doing responsive design, where we actually then pay attention to those numbers and how we want to do those different breakdowns based on the size of the user's display. So are they on a phone, or are they on a tablet, or are they on a laptop or a desktop, and how do we want our page to display differently for each of those sizes? Because if we make it look good on a phone, it generally looks really bad on a desktop display. If we make it look good on our desktop, it sucks on a phone because the phone is just physically a smaller screen. It may have more pixels than our desktop display, but the inches are smaller of the actual display, so everything is super tiny, and we don't want that as part of it. And then we're also going to set a minimum height as well, and on this one we're going to set that to 100%. So now, as we've done this, I'm going to save this, and I can go over and I can reload my page, and I can see, okay, now my page shows up. Now what we can do is we can start shrinking our page down, and we will see as it gets to certain sizes. Actually, let's not do it that way. We'll just shrink it this way. So we have our page. We can see how it shrinks down. And now it's, once I get to a smaller number, looking at the little number appearing up here, we'll see up to, and then once I'm pushing on 960, it's shrinking, moving, going down, and then at 640 it stopped making it smaller. So we can see where we have an expandable page, but there's a minimum size and a maximum size, which gives us a little better layout so that our length of line is not too big when we look at it on screen. Things that it's asking us to do is to center our page. And one thing that we can do, because we have set a width on this object, if we set the left and right margins to auto, what's going to happen is it's going to now center our content within our browser window. So if I save this and refresh, now we can see it's nicely centered on the screen. So what we're doing is we're setting our left and right margin to auto, and that gives us that nice centered view that makes most people happy. For whatever reason, people feel better about the page when it's centered within their display screen. The thing that we're being asked to do is to then control the box model for a number of elements. So we're going to set the box model for header, UL, nav, LI, and A. We're going to set their box model. And this, by setting the box model for our elements, we're able to take better control over how they display based on margins, padding, and borders, and how their size is calculated. That if you do this all the time, you're going to be much happier. If you just set box sizing, we have content box and border box, so that if we just set things at border box with it. It works better if we leave it at content box. Then what ends up happening is our sizes, depending on what attributes we have modified on our elements, our layouts are going to behave in mysterious and unpredictable ways. I mean, it's predictable if you understand the nuance of how the box model works, but it's unpredictable because it's not following what you think should be logical. Box sizing border box allows sizing to be a logical. It makes sense. You say something's this big, and that includes all the parts of that object. It includes the border and the padding and the margins. If you go with content box, margins don't get included on the size. So then you're trying to lay things out, but you've used margins to move things over, and your whole thing blows up on your face, and then you curse and scream and have to use all kinds of foul pirate-style language. And if small children are present, that would be traumatic. Next thing that we need to do is prevent the collapsing content issue of when we take elements on our page, we float them, that pulls them out of the normal document flow, and the container that they're in is going to collapse. It's going to then go, oh, I don't exist anymore because I have no content, and then it effectively disappears. So our nice little box where we're floating our content that has a pretty colored background, poof, it just went away. So we have to prevent that. And our instructions, what it says is it's asking us to look at anything that has the row class on it. Well, the class of row, in this case, has been attached to the header, but row has also been attached onto UL. That's the beauty of working with classes. Classes are things that we can use more than one time on a single page. And because we can do that, when we are defining the style rule for classes, then all we do is reference that class using the dot notation of dot row. So on the previous project, we did div.row because we were looking at a row class that was only assigned to divs. So the instructions in the book said, well, use div.row as that's the way to do it. And that makes sense if that class is only being put onto a div. Now, if I wanted the row to be, if I said header.row and do something, and then on the next line I said ul.row, do something, I could define a different style rule for row in each of these specific instances. Because these are lines here, header.row, that's what's called a selector. And that selector, this says any header element with the row class attached to it, any UL with the row class attached to it. But if I'm trying to make all rows, if I'm modifying all rows and want to modify the property for these, we say row clear both. And so we're using our container collapse hack or fix, depending on how you want to look at it. And then we're going to say row after. And on this one, then we can put in both content, empty string, and display table. So we're putting in our container collapse fix. You can call it a hack, you can call it a fix, depending on whether you're viewing it in a negative or positive, half full, half empty kind of glass. So we put that in, that takes care of our collapsing container, so we can just forget about that now and move on. And now we move into the header where the real fun is going to start occurring, because as we try and define the header, we're going to control how that shows up on screen, then the navigation that shows with that, and then the navigation that shows underneath it, then work on the topics and comments and footer as we're working our way down our page and controlling our layout. The element that we're going to work on is on the image that is occurring inside our header. So with that, we can say header, and as we're trying to designate or select this image, if we had other images occurring inside our header, we would have to be more concerned about it. If I just said header image, that would take any image that's occurring inside the header, and that would affect that with what I'm putting in the next style rule. If I use the angle bracket or the greater than sign, so header, and then go image, this says the image that is a child of, so header is here, image is a child because it's inside the header. It's not next to, but it's inside, therefore it's a child of the header. So if I say that image, as I put it in there, we want to set its display property to block, give it a width of 70%, and then float it left. Now when I look at what's happened, we can see how the image changed its size. It's now floating left. It's taking up approximately 70, well technically it'd be exactly 70% of the width of the header. And now our other navigation here is appearing to the side of that, so we're making progress. Our header masthead is starting to fill what's occurring on the screen. So the next item that we're going to work with is this nav UL list that we have here. That is the list going down on the side of that picture. So now we want to take that, and it will be header. Now within the header, we can say, well, anything, the nav is going to be a child of that, and a child of the nav is our UL. So that says, that gets really specific. In this case, because the header only has one nav occurring within it, if I say header nav, it finds that nav, then it finds a UL occurring within it. That is also going to work as a selector. So in this instance, whether we use the angle brackets or not, it's still going to give us the same result. So if we start looking for answers on when should we or shouldn't we use those, it's a matter of, for the logo image, if I had other images occurring on this navigation, if I said header image without the angle bracket, it would affect images within there as well, because I only want this one image, and that image is the one that's a child of the header. I'm using that as a safety measure. In this case, whether we use the angle brackets or not, by the time we've gone header nav UL, the likelihood of there being multiple navs with ULs in them inside the header is pretty slim. So we can kind of make a safe bet that we could get away with not having to bother with that. Now, within that, we can float this to our left. Now, the reason we need to float this to the left on it is because if we didn't float it to the left and we potentially had enough links on it, or our navigation was taking up too much space that it was taller than this picture, then things would start, we'd get some weird alignments going on, and we'll see that when we start playing around with some of these other elements in a little bit. So we're going to float it to the left, and then we can set the padding of our left at 2%, and our padding right at 2%. And figuring out those percentages of like, well, how much do I want? Why do I choose that? And that really is going to be based on working on your design. So when you've created a design and you figured out how you want things to show up on screen, how you want them to be spaced and laid out, then you start figuring out those percentages of, well, what percent should I use? 70%, 2%, 5%, or all of those numbers start coming after you've worked out this is what I want it to look like in the first place. Closer on the instructions, it actually is just saying header nav, set that, float that, not the UL. Now, the next thing is we need to set under our header nav ul a tag. So we're drilling all the way down to our links, which again, do I use angle brackets or not? We'll try it both ways and see whether we have a difference occur. So we're going to set things as a block and then set the width of these elements to 100% of their parent. And when we do that, we'll see how now that we're getting that spacing occurring on the edges. That's the padding. And then we can now see how our links space themselves out by using display block and setting the width to 100%. That allows those edges to go all the way across. If we turn that off, all right. So by not having display block, then the elements don't expand out. So on our anchor tags, when we put display block on them, it makes the link itself, that whole highlight area, so it's not just the letters, but the entirety of the link, become as big as its parent container, which is the list item, so that it is now able to expand itself out. And the width is, in this case, taking it off, it doesn't seem to have any major effect. So that's something. Display block is kind of giving us the width 100. So it could be on some browsers we may have to worry about that per the instructions. But what you're going to find is when you build style rules yourself from scratch, is that you are going to put them in and put in just the parts you think you need. Don't put everything under the sun going, well, I think I may need this, this, and this because I remember something about that somewhere when I was doing some case study. Only put in what you think you need, and if it works, be done. If you find out later you need more, then you put in more. But don't keep putting in everything to figure out, is that what we need to happen? So now if I modify a value, by modifying that padding right, you can see how now that right margin doesn't match what's on the left. It doesn't go all the way over as it works it out. So changing that is now changing that value. If we go to a bigger, we can see it makes them skinnier. So it makes it look better when the stripe goes most of the way across. It also makes it easier to click on because I don't have to be as close to the link. I just have to be anywhere within that area. And that's why that 2% is a nice value.
If you put it on auto.
So we've completed the vertical navigation. Now we're going to move into the horizontal navigation with this. And for this, we need to set the items as blocks, give them a width of 12.5, and put them on the left margin. So the items within our horizontal navigation, as we look at it here, we can access that by saying nav. Now we're no longer in the header, because notice header ended. So we're now in a sibling to the header, which is this nav. Nav here has a class of horizontal attached to it. So if this was the only time I was using horizontal, I could just set horizontal like that, and that's going to affect what's in it, except we have to go a little deeper because I want to affect the list items. Now if you notice, I didn't go UL, LI, I just said LI. And we're going to see how that works. But if that makes you uncomfortable, you can always go nav.horizontal because nav has the class of horizontal on it. And then we do have the UL there, which has a class of row. And then we have our list items, and then we're now going to be setting their properties here. And we get their display to set as a block. Now, that doesn't have any change on the page yet. We'll give them a width of 12.5%, not 15, 12.5%. And now when I do that, you can see how they changed. And the next thing that I want to do is to float them to the left. So I'll set that up. And now that takes them from that vertical list and makes it go horizontally across the screen. So now we're able to get them to show up. Now to prove that we can work with this, if I get rid of nav there, okay, that still worked. Now I can even get rid of UL and see that it works. So something with the horizontal class, and there's a list item within it. So when we are using selectors to select, that's a really bad sentence. When we are trying to select something through a style rule, if we just say list item, that would affect all list items. So we have to say which list item. In this case, I want list items that are inside something that has the class of horizontal. Now, looking through the rest of my HTML, I can see that there is no more horizontal, so that is why I can get away with that in this instance. Now, you may want, so that it makes more sense when you work on this, looking at your document, to say, well, I want it to be the nav, and I know that LI is going to be a child of the UL. So you work your way all the way down the hierarchy, because that makes it easier when you look at your style rule to understand what it's referring to. So it's not a bad idea to be really specific like this, but you don't have to be. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Section that we're working on is the topic section here, and with this we want, under topics, we'll notice topics is just a list. It does have that class of row attached to it so that it doesn't collapse, because we're going to be floating all of these list items within it. Now each list item contains a picture and a paragraph, and we'll be setting the properties for the list item and the picture and the paragraph. So that's going to require us to create a couple different style rules to pull this off. So the first thing that we are going to be trying to do here is access topics. So I can just say topics using that hashtag topics. That creates the rule for that. And within that, I want to modify the list item. So I'll just use my verbose syntax of ULLI on it, and we'll set them as display block and give it a width of 20%, and then we'll float them left and set the left margin to 0 and the right margin, we'll set that at 1.5%. And we're still going to have to do some more things to finish getting everything to show up correctly. And then after we do that, we should have our topics displaying beautifully on screen. The thing that we want to do within this is we want to set under topics, we want to make the first one and the last one behave a little bit differently. So I can now say topics, UL, LI, and then with this we can say first of type. So we're going to grab the first one that's showing up in our list. And we're also going to be modifying our last one. So that says, let's do something to the first item here, and we will do something to the last item here. We're going to treat them a little bit different. And technically, because well, actually, no, they're not the same one. I was thinking we were doing the same property, but we're not. So on the first one, we'll set the margin, its left margin to 7.75%. And on the last one, we'll set the right margin to 7.75%. And nothing was happening because if I look at what I've done here, it's UL with an ID of topics. And I said, in the ID of topics, I'm looking for a UL. So I totally screwed that one up. UL actually belongs UL topics and then LI, which is why when I refreshed the page previously, nothing happened. So if we move those over, then it displays properly. Yeah, there we go. Except the pictures are a little bit big. We're going to modify that in a moment. So the UL tag with an ID of topics. UL tag with an ID of topics, then we're grabbing that list item. If I just skipped the UL entirely and just said hashtag topics LI, it would have worked. But because I was caught up in this UL-LI relationship, I had a little momentary brain lapse that prevented it from working properly. So now we're getting much closer to having the whole thing show up on screen correctly. Now, we'll just repeat this process of UL topics and then LI image. So images that are within that, we're going to modify their properties on those images and use our standard display it as a block. So by default, images display as inline. So images are like letters or characters on steroids because each letter displays inline. One goes next to each other, next to each other, next to each other. But if we want it to be a block, then it becomes its own self-contained element with its own padding and margin and gets to be on its own line as well. So then after we've done that, then we'll give it a width of 50%, not 505, but 50%. And then we can set its margin left to auto. And we can also set the right margin to auto. And in doing that, the pictures shrink down to fill the size of 50% of their parent. And they center themselves within each of the block. So now it's looking much better on screen. A tiny little element that's just thrown in the middle of our markup that's really easy to miss, and it's a horizontal rule. Horizontal rules are self-closing tags, so we can put in the closing bracket or just use HR, whatever makes you happy, whether you want to self-close or not. Now with this, I'm going to say my HR tag, horizontal rule, I will just set its width to 50%. And once I do that, now we get that nice little line that separates this kind of 4-block unit from what will become these testimonials that we will be looking at next. And that's under the comments section. So working into the comment section, we're going to, so the section with comments, I can just say comments because I know there's only one section, and I can now give it a width of 75%, so it's a little bit narrower, and now I can just set my margin. In this case, I want to set my top and bottom to 40 and my left and right margin to auto. So it's possible to use the shorthand notation for margin. If we only list two values, the first value represents my top and bottom setting. The next value represents my left and right. Now, another way that I could write this would be margin and go top, right, bottom, left. So top, right, bottom, left if I use 4 values, and if I want to be really slow about it, and then margin top and margin bottom. So 3 methods that all generate the same result. If you're setting 4 different values, just putting them all in one line works really nice. If you know you're doing top and bottom at the same value and you want left and right to be auto, this is an awesome one. But if it's not auto, you certainly could put in a value. If it was 50 pixels, you could do that. And that'd be your left and right margins would be 50 pixels. But the auto helps to center it. So you can use whichever method works best for you. If you get used to reading it as top, right, bottom, left, or treble, then that's a very convenient way of doing it. If you want to do each one on its own line so that you spell each one out, because that works better for you so you don't have to remember orders or how shorthands work, totally fine. It's all valid CSS. It's up to you as to what you want to do. What we need to do inside our comment section is we need to modify our list items to control how they are going to display on screen. And with these, we want to display them as a block, of course, and set their width to 50%, because our goal here with these list items is we're going to turn it into 2 columns. If it's 50%, it can now float to one next to each other, so then we start creating this 2-column grid. So our goal is to create that 2-column grid, and we can do that by using 50%. If we wanted to create a 3-column, we could use 33%, and then it would create a grid that way. And maybe we'll play with that just to see what happens. We'll float them. Float them to the left and give bottom margin of 30 pixels. And that just creates some extra padding, kind of a spacing between each of the elements. Now when we look at it, we can see how they start floating and working their way on screen. So we're starting to take shape with this. We've created 2 columns of elements. Now just for kicks, if I knock this down to 33, we'll see that created a 3x3 grid. Now you will notice that the footer has wandered itself up the screen, because by floating the elements here in this comment section, now the comment section is here, it's not a row, so it's kind of collapsing a little bit. So once we add in some rule information for the footer, we're going to be able to overcome that, and then the footer's not going to be hiding its blue stripe behind there. So it's kind of cool though, the way that we can create this look of, well, if I go to 33%, we know that it creates a 3-column layout. If I go to 50, it creates a 2-column layout. Hashtag comments list item image allows us to access the images because we want to change how they display on screen. So we want to make them not inline but display as a block. Want to give them a width of 20%. So we're making them a little bit smaller. We'll float them to the left within the respective block. So we're seeing what's here. Now we're going to float them so then the text, we'll see how the text then wraps around a little bit. And we want a left margin of 5% and a right margin of 5%. So we will notice that by changing the block, setting them a width, but then most importantly by floating them, the text is now appearing next to them. Now, an interesting thing is going to happen next as we work on this. Is the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to modify or set a rule for these paragraphs. So in my comments, and then my paragraphs that are inside my list items. So we'll set a style rule for those. And with that, we will float those to the left and give them a width of 70%. And now let's save that and see what happens. And I refresh the page and we don't see anything happening. And there's a reason for that. Because the text, if I look at the text here, the text is not big enough to extend under the picture. So what I'm going to do is just add some text. And we can see, as we're adding text in, how the text sits next to the picture, but it doesn't go under it. Now, on the paragraphs, we don't float them, because before we put this rule in, and then after we put the rule in, we didn't see a change. But now, by removing that float, we can see how the text wraps around and underneath the picture. So the reason that we're floating it and setting their width is because then it becomes its own self-contained element, and then it now closes its width out so that it will be next to it. Now, this is one method for doing it. We could have also set the margin for the text. We could have left it, we didn't have to float it. We could just give it a left margin. That would be the width of the picture with the picture's padding, and then it would push the text over, and then that would work too. So when it comes to how we generate the CSS, what we do for creating our design and layout, there isn't one and only one way to do it. Our different style rules we create, there's a variety of ways that we can arrive at our end destination. And as we start creating more individualized layouts, how we get there is going to start to become as varied as the number of people working on the project. That we need to do is to access the footer. If we look into the markup down at the bottom, we'll see the footer is a tag, so I can just go grab the footer, and inside the footer I can just simply say clear both, and in doing that it clears the styling, because right now we can see how the footer is now showing next to the comment section. It's not going below it because that is now floating. So now I'll refresh my page now that I've put that on, and we've now completed it, where my footer sits down at the bottom. I have the comments here. The text and pictures are side by side. Now I have pictures above and below and text below. They're all nicely sized to create my topics. I have my horizontal navigation, vertical navigation.